My name is Dominic Fuller. I'm the president of the club this year, and it's very good to see all these familiar faces, people like Tony Waltham, John Lester, Simi Suchantan, Kusuma Bekan Tun, who was the administrative manager at the Bangkok Post many years ago. These are all people that know Roger extremely well. They're all part of the Bangkok journalistic furniture going back decades. Roger Crutchley's probably forgotten, but he was one of the first editors to lay out my stories for Sunday Extra many years ago. Anyway, before we get going with this evening, I just want to let you know a few things that we've got on the horizon. We have a documentary on Monday. Tomorrow We Disappear, which is about an Indian slum, and apparently it's very revealing. Next Monday we have a rather sad occasion. We have the funeral for Mike Smith, who's a very long-term member of the Foreign Correspondents Club here and also the Foreign Correspondents Club in Hong Kong. And he was a stalwart of the British Club as well, and he passed away about 5 weeks ago unexpectedly. And his funeral will be next Monday at Wat Ta Tong, which is on Ekamai, and his cremation will be the following day, Tuesday the 15th at 5 in the evening, also at Wat Ta Tong, and there will be a wake in the FCCT here for him afterwards, and so everybody is welcome to that. Other things that we have on the horizon, next week we're having a program on the great greenwashing debate in Thailand, which is about sustainable business and whether it's actually possible to run a sustainable, environmentally friendly business in this country. It's based on a book that was recently released on the subject, and we have some very distinguished speakers coming. We have Krip Rojana Satien, who's the son of Bunchu Rojana Satien, one of the great economic tsars of Thailand, and he'll talk about his quadruple bottom line business solution. We have Sarini Achavaran Nuntakun, who's the co-founder and member of the editorial board of Thai Publica. She's a very active spokesman for the whole green business. We have Anthony Watanabe, who is the managing director of Asia Clean Innovations, and we have Bimsupa Kutalanan, who's the editor of the book, which is in Thailand's Sustainable Business Guide. Right, just a few other things. The following week we have tentatively a program on the plastics crisis in the world with another distinguished panel of speakers. That's on the 23rd of May. On the 30th of May we have the new EU ambassador to Bangkok coming to address the club, so he'll be making a keynote address. And on the 31st we have Italian writers in Bangkok who will be gathering to talk about their writing. It's the second program they've done. So just two other things. As I say, it's very nice to see a friendly crowd full of familiar faces. It would be even better if you were members of the club. This is the most open club in Bangkok, has a very friendly atmosphere. We do programs all the time. So if you feel like joining, please do. There'll be a category for you. And the other thing is just to remind you, if you're already a member, that your spouse can have a card, spouse or partner, a card entitling them to full membership rights. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Jim Pollard, who will moderate the programme this evening. Jim.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. For those of you who don't know, Roger on the far end there is a well-known figure within the expat media. I'm not sure how well-known he is amongst the Thai media, but I was on The Nation for about 17 years, and everyone over there knew about Crutch. And anyway, so it's very nice to see that, one, you've been able to get your book together, and I've heard it's very good. Well, we're going to start off with a short talk by Roger. I think Roger's been here. It was on the Post 40 years?
Yes, about 40 years.
Okay. And just beside him is Tony Waltham, who got dragged away from the bar to sit up here at late notice, but thank you very much, Tony. Tony's a man who features in the book and knows Roger very well. They shared a house or a number of houses for a while, and you'll hear a little bit about that. Well, I think actually both of them were on their way to Australia and never quite got there. Maybe they heard people like me were down there. But anyway, the other man here in the corner is Colin Hastings. Colin does this magazine, and there's a nice little piece in there about Roger and his book. And he'll give you another perspective, but Colin also did many years at the Bangkok Post, so there'll be a number of Bangkok Post people here tonight. Anyone here from the Bangkok Post? Can you put up your hand? Thank you. Okay, quite a few. All right, nice that you've come along. Thank you, and Roger, I'll hand it over to you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim, for that very nice introduction. I'm not sure whether I'm deserving of that exactly. Thanks also to Dominic, Richard, and everybody at the FCCT for organising this event, or not organising, but hosting this event. It's a great place to have such a thing. Also, I'd like to thank Colin, who's come along to help me out when I run out of steam, which won't be very long. And also Tony, my old friend Tony Waltham, who you'll be hearing from both of them fairly soon, I think. I'll get down to exactly what this is all about, why I decided to write this book. Lots of people I met while I was doing the rounds expressed interest in the fact that I had travelled overland from England to Thailand back in 1969, when it was possible to do that sort of thing. And they also expressed interest about what Thailand was like in the late 60s and early 70s. So I thought, when I retired, and I'm getting on a bit, I thought I'd better write it down before it's all forgotten. And initially it wasn't going to be a book, but the more I wrote, the more I realised there was potential for a book. And that's how this all came about. I should point out that when I left England, I had no plan to come to Thailand. Thailand wasn't on the route. So the fact that I've been living here for the past 49 years suggests there was something seriously wrong with my planning. What I had intended to do was get to New Delhi and then work my way down towards Australia through Indonesia. There was a certain route that backpackers did in those days, and that was my intention. But it didn't quite work out that way. But I did get to Australia eventually, 27 years later. I think to give you an idea of our travelling arrangements, let's see if I press the right button there. Oh, no, that's my mum and dad. Right, there are the two buses that we travelled out on from London. I can't remember which one we were on. That skinny wretch in front of the buses is me, I'm afraid. When we left, of course, I didn't know anybody. There were probably about 30 people gathered in London when we got on these buses, and we sort of split up into two groups. And I didn't know anybody on the bus at all. And but obviously after a while you got to know a few people. And one of the first people I got to know well was another English guy, and his name is Clarence Shettlesworth. And I'm glad to say that, very pleased to see Clarence is here tonight. Clarence, please stand up. So Clarence and I were on the bus, and we arrived in Thailand together, so 49 years ago. And I think we both thought we'd probably stay here a few weeks or a few months at most, but here we are still after all these years. And it's great to have you here, Clarence, because I haven't seen you for a few years. Next year, 50. Oh, next year Clarence has ordered me to go up to Chiang Mai and celebrate our 50th year in Thailand. So that sounds promising. Those of you that have got copies of the book, you might be noticed that the second chapter is entitled "Saved by the Beatles," and that might seem a slightly odd title, but I'll explain. One of the fellows on our bus had this cassette tape of what was then the new Beatles album. It was the Double White album, and it just come out and it was very popular. So as we slept on these buses most of the time, occasionally we stopped off at sleazy hotels, and I do mean sleazy, and so we slept on the buses. So every day we heard this Beatles tape, and I think just to give you an idea of what it was like, this is the music. This is some of the music that we heard every day on this trip for about 2 months running. You might know the song.
I hope you're not going to sing for us.
Okay, well, yeah, that's enough of that, but you get the idea. Every day we heard this song, and I'll put it back on. Okay, sit back and enjoy the Beatles for the rest of the night. I need some help from Danny there, I think. Anyway, also on that album, we got to know the album pretty well, as you could imagine. For 2 months we heard these songs, and there was another song on the album fairly early on called Obladi Oblada. Don't worry, I'm not going to play that. Although we could go through the whole album if you want. But anyway, it wasn't the Beatles' best song, but it was a good sing-along song, and I think, Clarence, it kind of became the bus anthem in a way. And when it came on, I'd look around on the bus and see all the people, everyone was singing, Obladi, Oblada. And there we were going through the Iranian, the snow in Iran and eastern Turkey, and it was probably is a bizarre scene, but it was absolutely great fun. So that was partly that I thank the Beatles because they kept me a little bit sane during the long periods on the buses, and also I thank goodness it wasn't a rap song that the fellow had on his tape. So where are we? Okay. I think we travelled through Asia. It was the middle of winter. We left in January, and so we were in eastern Turkey and Iran were the coldest places, and it was really, really freezing. And some mornings they had to light fires under the bus to melt the diesel oil of the bus. So you can imagine the buses, that wasn't probably the way buses should be treated, and not those old things there. And eventually the buses broke down for good. Unfortunately, they didn't choose the best of places. It was the middle of the Afghan desert. And so there we were. And both buses broke down at the same time. It was rather convenient. And so we spent a couple of days waiting for them to be fixed. But then the drivers, and we slept under the stars. It was quite an interesting period. And then the drivers came up and said, sorry, these buses aren't going any further. So we split up into little groups and went our own way. And I was with Clarence, and a couple of the girls from the coach came along with us for company. And we carried on by local transport. And local transport in Afghanistan was travelling on a rickety old bus with goats and chickens and things like that. And we ended up in, we got as far as Kandahar, and then we didn't stay there long, and we got a bus to Kabul. In Kabul, I was really, really sick, and from food poisoning, and so I don't have very happy memories of Kabul. But by the time I'd recovered, Clarence and the others had had enough of Kabul too, I think. And so we headed off on local transport again up the Khyber Pass. And that was magnificent, because Khyber Pass was something I'd sort of read about in novels and seen on films, but I never actually expected to be travelling myself up the Khyber Pass. And the Khyber Pass and the Hindu Kush, the whole range there, was just magnificent. So after that we got into Pakistan, and after that most of our travel was on trains, and they were crowded trains, and I would think Clarence would agree, very crowded trains, and you just couldn't get any sleep. We tried to sleep in the corridors, tried to sleep anywhere. And I can remember on one particular stage, we clambered up into the overhead luggage racks and tried to sleep dangling from the luggage racks, but that didn't work either. But somehow we eventually made it to New Delhi, which was our original destination. So that was, in a way, it was quite an achievement. We needed a bit of a break, so we went up to Nepal for a week, which was very, very nice. But unfortunately, we were running out of money rapidly, and Clarence and I ended up in Calcutta. By this time, I'd given up hope of getting to Australia, but Clarence had some money waiting for him in the bank in Malaysia, in Alor Setar. And so that was our next target, to get to Alor Setar. And the only way to do that was to fly to Bangkok and go down to Malaysia. So we just had enough money for 2 tickets to Bangkok. And I must admit, when getting on the plane, I actually felt a little bit guilty, because I was on an overland trip, and getting on a plane isn't really overland. So I felt like I was cheating a bit, but of course you couldn't go through Burma as it was in those days. The only way you could get to Bangkok. The only way you could get to Malaysia was via Bangkok. So we arrived late at night on April the 9th, 1969. It was so late we didn't try to get into Bangkok that night. We decided to sleep at the airport at Don Mueang, and we clambered. It was so hot, stiflingly hot. We clambered up on the roof, tried to get some breeze and get some sleep on the roof, but we were, of course, interrupted by squadrons of mosquitoes. So that put an end to that. Anyway, we were in Bangkok a couple of days, and the girls wisely decided they wanted to go on to Australia, and they left. So that left Clarence and myself to decide what we were going to do. So, well, we knew what we were going to do. We had to get to Alor Star to get some money. But we didn't have any money for transport to get down to Malaysia, so we hitchhiked. And so we hitched for about 4 or 5 days, down from Bangkok down to Hajiai. And it was a great experience, it was a wonderful experience. But it also, of course, coincided with Songkran. And we didn't know anything about Songkran. And then we had people throwing buckets of water over us and things like that. And we had no idea what it was about. But I think from that time onward, Clarence and I knew that Thailand was rather different to England. So anyway, we had this, the people who gave us lists were lovely people, and so we got to Hajiai. There we had to take a taxi, a communal taxi, to the border. And there were it was an old Chevrolet. Was it a Chevrolet, Clarence? Yeah. And there's about eight people crammed into this Chevrolet. And as we were belting along the road towards Sadao, the border, and a storm broke, which is quite normal here, of course. But then the rear tyre of the taxi we were in blew, and the taxi turned turtle and rolled into the ditch. And Clarence was thrown out, I recall, and thrown into the ditch. But I was still in the taxi, sort of going like this. I thought it was my last moments coming. But as it turned out, we were okay. We were a bit shocked, but no one was seriously injured. But there were some ladies sitting in the front row of the taxi, and they were pretty bloodied, but they were okay, nothing too serious. So we arrived at the... I forgot this. We had to get to the border, so we started hitching again. And the truck stopped and we hopped in the back. It turned out to be a fish truck and had loads of fish flapping about in the truck. So anyway, we didn't care because we just wanted to get to the border. So you can imagine, we arrived at the Malaysian border, we hopped out of this truck, and there we were, really bedraggled and muddy from the accident, soaking wet because it was still raining, and stinking of fish. And even worse, we didn't have any money at all. So you can imagine the Malaysian immigration, they took one look at us and said, no, no. And I thought I agreed with them entirely. But anyway, we talked to them, and they were a bit worried because we didn't have any money. And usually immigration people don't let you through if you haven't got any money. Fortunately, Clarence had a watch. And I remember he sold his watch to raise the bus fare to Alor Star. And that's how we got to Alor Star. And a lot more things happened, but we haven't got time for all that. But anyway, we got there, and eventually we got the money. We spent a week in Malaysia, but we decided we'd liked what we'd seen of Thailand, so we came back up, got to Songkhla, very lucky to get, as a boat just leaving, a Thai Maritime Navigation Company boat. It was a kind of a cargo boat, and we got a ride on that, 75 baht deck class. That's sleeping on the deck, and which it took a marvellous journey that was, up the Gulf of Thailand. And the most of the crew, we ate with the crew, and most of the crew were young Thai kids, and they were delighted to have a couple of weird foreigners on their boat. And they went out their way to make us happy, and they got their transistor radios, and they kept tuning into stations which had Western pop music. And there we were, sitting on the deck, sailing down the Gulf with Petula Clark singing whatever she sang. I've forgotten the name of the song, but Kiss Me Goodbye, was it something? Anyway, all those. So that was a wonderful trip. And as we reached the Chao Phraya and we wound our way down towards Bangkok. Clarence and I discussed what we're going to do, and we thought, well, we might stay in Thailand another couple of months. So, okay, 49 years later. I'll skip the next bit. We did some teaching for a while, which was quite an experience. I won't talk about it tonight, but it's in the book, and I hope you find it quite entertaining, because Clarence and I were experiencing new things every day. I must say, the first year or so, it was great to have someone like Clarence around, because when you first arrive in Thailand, you get quite a lot of culture shock, and you need to bounce things off one another to work out what's going on. And that worked out very well. Anyway, I'll move on to when I joined the Post 6 months after we arrived, in November 69. And I didn't know it at the time, but the Bangkok Post and I were the same age. We were both 23 then. You can work out the maths now. But anyway, so the best thing for me though was I never even considered working on a newspaper before, but I really, really enjoyed the work. I was interested in current affairs and the news and sports news, and it just fitted my interests. And so I actually was in the strange position of having a job where I actually, when I woke up in the morning, I was looking forward to going to work because I really enjoyed it. And that's how it remained nearly all the time at the Post over all those years. Now, one of the first people I met at the Post was another English guy called Peter Finucane. Is Peter here?
Okay.
Peter, is
Can
here?
Peter stand up?
Yeah. Okay, Peter, that's great to see you. You don't have to say anything. I'll tell everybody about you. Okay, well, Peter was the chief sub-editor at the time. He sat in the middle of a horseshoe desk, the old-fashioned horseshoe desk. Anyway, we got on very well. I was just a proofreader when I started off, but became a sub-editor. And Peter and I got on very well because one reason was we both liked what we called soul music in those days. And that's the days of sort of Marvin Gaye, James Brown, Otis Redding, Aretha Franklin. Peter and I loved all that stuff. And we had the bonus that at that time there were all these bars on Petbury Road, New Petbury Road, that catered for the GIs who were on R&R from Vietnam. The war was still going on at that time. So Peter and I were regulars down one end of that strip. It was a famous strip that's long forgotten now. There were 2 or 3 soul bars, let's call them. One was called Soul Sister, I think. Another, the Whiskey and Jazz was one. And anyway, Peter and I were regulars there because the bands were really good, excellent, top-class bands, and we had some wonderful times there. I also travelled with Peter down the deep south of Thailand, 2 years running. We went to Yala, Patani, Songkhla, and in those days, separatism wasn't the main problem, it was communists. The government were much more worried about the communists than the separatists at that time. And there were heavy military presence there at that time. I remember on one particular trip we went from Yala to Betong, the southernmost town, and there were traffic checkpoints all along that route. And Peter and I also went quite a bit to the northeast, and we particularly liked Nakhon Nowhere. Turned out was our favourite. Right, and if you haven't been to Nakhon Nowhere, it's a lovely spot, and you can look over the River Mekong there to the limestone mountains of Laos. It's a lovely sight. So anyway, thank you, Peter, for making me feel at home when I was first at the Post. Well, I've got 2 friends here who I've known for many years, who both worked on the Bangkok Post and both did the overland trip on different occasions. We didn't do it together, but we all did the overland trip from basically London to Bangkok. A lot of you will know Tony Waltham, and a lot of you will know that Tony and I shared a house for 30 years. Actually, we shared 4 houses for over a period of 30 years. So we got to know one another quite well. And we used to go on all sorts of trips together, particularly up in the northeast, but also to the west of Kanchanaburi, near the Burmese border. We had some wonderful trips. But one in particular was when we went to Cambodia for the visa run. And would you like to say a bit about that, Tony? And anything else you want to say?
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Yeah, it's a privilege to be here at this book launch with Roger's book here. And as he mentioned, well, I was following in his footsteps a year later from England, heading for Australia, but never quite making it in a sense of living there. I did go later on business trips to cover news events in Australia, but arrived in Thailand in 1970, 1 year after Roger, pretty much, and got a job at the Bangkok Post, which was actually, I would say, it was also a job that suited my skills and my experience. I had earlier worked on Student magazine with Richard Branson in London, so that was giving me some sort of justification for applying for a newspaper job and starting as a proofreader and so on. And of course, initially we had to go on visa runs, and when they opened the border to Cambodia, it was closer than Nong Khai to Laos. And Roger and I went on this one trip, and we had an interesting time, I would say. That it was very convenient to hop across, but we decided to travel on to Battambang, or Bantabong, and we spent the night there and a couple of nights, and then we went up to Siem Reap, which was actually, it was during the war, the Vietnam War, and it was now Cambodian War as well, and Laos was also afflicted by the insurgency and everything. And the Khmer Rouge were sort of, they were extending their reach, and there were checkpoints on the road up to Siem Reap all the way. And we got to the town, there was mortar fire all the time. You could hear the bang. At night it was like thunder and lightning. It was just shell fire and so on, and it was sort of kind of strange. Anyway, we did make it back, although we got sort of not ambushed, but we got to a checkpoint and they said, sorry, you cannot proceed. They're fighting on the road, and they were fighting, and there was sound of gunfire got louder and louder, and then they were actually shooting. The people at the checkpoint were shooting into the with their guns into the bushes beside us, and we were just huddled down in the back of this sort of taxi come vehicle, which was sort of like a rather cram-full van. And anyway, it died down after about, and this is covered actually in Roger's book, so I just mentioned it in passing now. But and the fighting died down, and the gunfire stopped, and we could carry on. So that was an interesting experience. And there's also there's a story Roger relates about one of the rather drunken Cambodian soldier with a hand grenade, and he sort of had it on the table with him, and then he was sort of opening unscrewing the cap, and people were running away, and we were sort of sitting there. And anyway, that was an interesting experience, and one of many experiences I've had with Roger on different trips, as he mentioned. We've been north, south, and east and west, so to speak, together, and of course, working together at the Bangkok Post, sharing houses in Sukhumvit, Soi 8, Soi 12, then off Soi Tong Lo, and Soi 49, and so on. So I must say Roger's a very accomplished journalist, and his column is very popular, Postscript, which he's still writing. And there's a book also, a Postscript book, if you haven't seen the copy. And I hope you enjoy his Nakhon Nowhere book, which is the launch today. So I'll keep it short, and thank you, Roger, for everything. And I'll pass it on to Colin Hastings, another former colleague at the Bangkok Post.
Yes, good evening, everybody. Nice to be here, thank you. Compared to these two guys, I'm a newcomer. I arrived in September 1974, also on an overland trip with the idea of getting to Australia, which, yes, I didn't make it either until 1988. Something about that place. But that's great, because it's been a marvellous 44 years here, and everything, I've obviously read Roger's book, and there's echoes of his life, my life throughout. We've shared experiences, all three of us together at various times over the years. But in fact, I was mentioning earlier to my friend Patrick at the back there, Patrick Govan Shrimp, and he was reminding me of something I told him a little while ago, that on my second night in Bangkok in September 1974, that's when I met Roger in a pub called The Pub. And he was playing darts, and I was terribly impressed, because there was a journalist working here in Bangkok. I was a journalist back in the UK before coming here. And Roger saying that he was working there, and I'd already thought, gosh, this is a great place. But from there I went on across the road to a place called Patpong, and went to a bar called Mississippi Queen, where I met Patrick Shrimp over there. And after meeting Shrimp, I went on to meet a young lady called Noi of Mississippi Queen. And so that first night in Patpong or Bangkok was really influential in my life. My gosh, wasn't it? Those three, Roger, Patrick and Noi from Mississippi Queen.
Blame it on Noi.
Blame it on Noi. But it was, the start of a great friendship with Roger and Tony. We shared experiences. And I was reading through the book about Soi 8, your house in Soi 8, where I used to go on a regular basis we used to play, if you recall, we used to play Scrabble
Yeah.
on a regular basis to waste time before we went out and, to eat and drink and carry on around town. Roger and I have had lots of different experiences together, and we share a love of music, of course, sport, which Roger and I both played in the same football team, which, believe it or not, won a couple of honours, didn't it, Roger?
Yes, no thanks to me, I mean.
No, he's modest, as always. Modest is Roger, because he was actually a very good fullback. Good timing. That red hair flowing everywhere as well. It was great. I shared a house with Roger and Tony at one stage in Soi 12, if you remember. That funny old house next to Darling Massage Parlour. It was there, actually, up until fairly recently, that house. Fairly recently in Soi 12, they finally demolished it. But that was a fun place. And the three of us, we would knock around the bars up on Sukhumvit, the Three Roses that you mentioned. Another bar that Roger used to call the Stale Peanut, because I think that was all that was in there of interest. But we also, in those early days, went down to enjoy the bars of what is Soi Cowboy now. And it's always, a bit of history there, because Soi Cowboy there was this guy called Cowboy, his nickname was Cowboy. He wasn't the first bar in Soi Cowboy, it was another one. It was called, the guy who ran it was called The Shake. What was it called, Roger, that bar?
Gold Label. Gold Label.
Gold Label. It was a fancy bar, the fanciest bar, nothing like it for a few more years. And to think we'd go down and have a great night out down there, amazing. But we kind of went round to Klong Toi, the Mosquito Bar, which again, Roger mentions in the book, and other places. And after we ran out of ideas, I remember one night Roger and Tony saying, they talked about Pepri Dapmai and all the bars that Roger was talking about earlier. That's all these great bars down there in the GI days. And they hadn't been down there for 10 years. So we said, well, let's go down there for a beer. So we went into the biggest, best-known bar down there called Thai Heaven. We walked in there, it was dark, full of girls, and Roger and Tony walked in, hadn't been there for 10 years. I remember a couple of girls coming up and saying, Roger, Tony, where have you been?
That can't be true.
Well, 9 years. And Roger and I have lots of other experiences. Roger and I went down by train to, again, it's mentioned in the book, we went down to meet a friend, a mutual friend called Lizzie in a place called Tak Bai, right on the border with Malaysia. And Roger and I both thought, when we were down there, we just thought this is the most gorgeous, tranquil place, unbelievably tranquil and serene. It was tremendous. But sadly, some years later, Tak Bai was the scene of a terrible, terrible disaster when 60 people were herded onto a bus and died of suffocation. And that was the beginning of the real present turmoil and troubles down there in southern Thailand. On the way back, we were on the train. It broke down, as obviously it did in those days, because everybody else on the train, when it broke down, didn't seem bothered, and we didn't. So we went along with that, and we spent the time having a lot of beers, a lot of fun with the locals, and got totally drunk, and finally ended up back in Bangkok about 12 hours later. It was a long journey, but fun. It was a sign of what Thailand was all about. There was another time, I don't know, sorry, you're going to say?
No, I just say, fortunately, we were in the restaurant car when it stopped. And that's where we stayed for the next 10 hours. And they actually ran out of beer. It was in the days when they still served beer on the railway restaurant cars. But it was the most marvellous evening. It was like a nightclub on wheels, except we weren't moving anywhere. Yeah.
Tremendous. And there was another time, I don't know whether Roger and Tony remember this, but I managed somehow to wangle the loan of a brand new Volvo car. I don't know how I got it, but we work in the Bangkok Post, and I got this car, and we drove up to Kanchanaburi, I think it was, and it was great. Young guys. I think Tony had in those days a Mini Moke, about the only person I knew had a car. But I got this Volvo, and we drove up to the border, somewhere near the border with Burma. And on the way back, this brand new, really expensive Volvo, as luck would have it, a stone flipped up, smashed in the windscreen broke, and as you have to do is you have to smash out the window. And then as luck would have it, as we ventured on back to Bangkok, the skies turned black. And it rained like hell coming into Bangkok. The whole car, inside the car, got flooded. And of course I had to return the car back to Volvo with huge apologies. And I remember I got into trouble with the managing director of the Bangkok Post because of the bill that was presented to the Bangkok Post, which is about the equivalent to my salary. And luckily the Bangkok Post footed the bill. Thank heavens for that. But do you remember that journey up there? Yeah, it was many journeys. But I have to say, just to round off, I don't want to go on too much, but loads of memories with Roger and Tony over the years. It's been wonderful. Roger was influential in my early days of, even getting a job in the Bangkok Post. I'm very happy that I publish a magazine. I've been doing it for the last 20 years, nearly 20 years, The Big Chili. And I'm happy to get Roger on the front cover. And I'm also very happy that, to have Roger working for me 2 weeks a month. I think that's about all he needs to do these days.
That's all I can handle these days.
No. But you still go for a beer across the road in the pub. And it's been a privilege knowing Rog. He's a great mate. And thank you for inviting me along to be here tonight, Rog. And thank you, everybody, for being here to support Roger. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if anyone would like, there's a microphone there where Rung is. You'd like to ask a question of our distinguished guests from the media section, please do. Just tell us who you are, where you're from. Rog, you've got something more.
Yeah, Jim, I was just going to show a few photographs
please
from the book.
Go right ahead.
I'll try and whip through them quickly. I know time's getting on.
Good.
So, I also, at this point, I'd like to thank two people who are heavily involved with the book. First of all, John Lester, an old friend. John, John and I are old friends, but John edited this book, and I think he did a very good job. And he had to be very patient. And I can tell you for sure that whenever I write anything, it needs a lot of editing. John also he edited my first book, the Post published some years ago. Anyway, thanks, John. I used to play football and cricket with John, and unfortunately, John was much better at both sports than me. But never mind. Also, I'd like to thank Danny Spate, who has been involved in the actual production of the book, and not just for that, but Danny actually gave me a lot of encouragement, because there was a stage when I wasn't sure whether it was going to come out or not. And anyway, Danny gave me a lot of support, and I very appreciate that an awful lot. Like I said, have we got enough time for?
Yeah, go right ahead.
This is, if I can work this newfangled thing. Oh, here we go.
Khyber Pass.
Oh, yeah, Khyber Pass.
Is there any sign that Elton John had been there?
Okay, first of all, sorry about this, but family album time. My mum and dad, on one of my trips back, the reason I've just like to say something about this is because perhaps my one big regret in my life out here is that I didn't go back to see them often enough when I was first out here. So that I did go back to see them, but I didn't go back enough. So if anyone here has got folks back home, please go and see them as much as you can. We've seen that. We don't want to hear this. Yeah, Khyber Pass. Well, that was one. Obviously, you can't appreciate the Khyber Pass unless you've actually been there. But it was just the most amazing to think how they carved that out all those years ago. Just amazing, and what a wonderful experience. I think you all know where that is. I didn't do much sightseeing on the tour. We didn't have time for it. But I did manage to slip away from Delhi for a bit and go to Agra and experience the Taj. It was so hot there. I remember I put 1 foot on the marble floor. Well, I took about 2 feet on the marble floor, and then I jumped off again because it was so hot. It was just going to burn my feet. Guess where we are? Thailand street scene, about 1969. A dear old Samlor that didn't quite make it. The Samlors were in abundance in those days. I don't think there's so many about these days. This is the forgotten bit. This is when Clarence and I were teaching, and this was Chulalongkorn Day in 1969, where all the students in Bangkok all converged on Rajdamnern area, and that's me with some of the senior students. And there we are. There's Clarence there on the left, looking very handsome, and me looking rather silly. That was, I think it was Freshy Day, Clarence. I don't know whether you remember. It was a sort of a weird thing. Here we are, Bangkok Post. I joined the Bangkok Post, and in those days, they've got something called Reporters' Day in Thailand. They still have it, but in those days, on Reporters' Day, all the editorial staff got the day off, and we'd all go off together to some place. And this particular year, we went to Ayutthaya, and I'm the sort of weird-looking one in the middle.
Nice shirt.
All the Thai staff there. This was the big story in my early years in Bangkok, was when the Black September invaded the Israeli embassy, which was on Soi Langsuan at that time, and they were going to shoot hostages if they didn't get people out of jail back home. Fortunately, they had the Thais got their own sort of way of dealing with these things, and the foreign ACM Dawi and Major General Chachai went down to the embassy, took along with them assorted food and plenty of bottles of whiskey and wine. And believe it or not, they resolved the whole thing without anyone getting hurt, and they were treated to a flight back to Egypt, and that's them on their camels. Just in the background, there's the pyramids there. But that was the most unusual tale. After 1973, when we had the...
Roger, just a sec, sorry. Folks, up at the bar, could we just have a bit of quiet, please? It's not going to go on for that much longer. If you could just give us a bit of quiet. Thank you. Okay, Rog, okay, yeah. Rog, go.
In 73, they had the what student uprising, or what you'd like to call it, and we had 3 years of democracy, and of course, as far as the Thai workers saw it, democracy meant the chance of getting higher wages, but the factory owners didn't see it in the same way. And we had at the Bangkok Post, that's the Uchulian building there, we had the strike right on our doorstep. The girls from the Standard Garments textile factory, and it got pretty nasty actually. Anyway, this is one of the quieter moments when they burnt an effigy of somebody they didn't like. So not the most exciting picture, but I was quite honoured to get the award, the Ayamongkon Award, I was the first non-Thai to get the award. But the reason that's in there was because Ayamankon was a wonderful writer. He was a Thai writer, and he used to work for The Nation most of the time. And he was one of the few Thai writers who really had a go at the authorities. He was very brave, but also very witty. And I wouldn't miss his column for the world. He had a column a couple of times a week in The Nation. But he was also a very nice chap. I ran into him a few times. And even when he was at The Nation, he used to send me letters commenting on what I'd written and congratulating me on when he thought I'd written something good, and advising me when he thought it wasn't so good. And I was very pleased. He eventually moved to the Bangkok Post, and I was in the great position of editing his columns, so that was marvellous for me. And unfortunately, he died far too young, and I was very honoured when I got that award a few years later. I mentioned the student uprising. You can call it a lot of different things, but I'll call it student uprising. That was just before everything erupted on Rajdamnern Avenue. I happened to go down there on October the 14th, and I witnessed what was going on. It was a quite amazing experience. I've never been in such a big crowd, apart from at Wembley. And these people, I've never seen any such anti-government protest before like that. And I was there, but I have to admit that when things got very heavy, when a helicopter came overhead, and it looked quite menacing, I got out of there. But I went back to the U-Tuling building, and that was the first article I ever wrote for the Post, came from an eyewitness report from that particular thing. Oh dear. Well, that crutch on crutches. After a football injury, and I was silly. I couldn't miss out on the New Year party, so I had to go with my crutches and all. When I was first here, steam trains were still pulling the express trains. I love steam trains. So look at them, how shiny they are. The engineers really looked after those engines. That was marvellous. And it's such a shame that there's hardly any left now. I think it's just a couple survived. That picture is right in the south somewhere. I can't remember exactly where. Tony will remember this. Tony talked about the trip to Cambodia. This was the train we travelled on from Poipet to Battambang. As you can see, it was not exactly the Oriental Express. The people, however, were very friendly. Unfortunately, Tony spoke good French, unlike me. So we had some good conversations with them. And there we are. Tony mentioned before about the fellow with the grenade. Well, he didn't make it up. There it is. This fellow he was really drunk, and he came staggering up, and he wanted to show off his pet grenade. And as Tony said, it was a pretty hairy time. That's in Siem Reap. Also, something I didn't mention before. At that time, the Viet Cong had just taken over Angkor Wat, which was just a few kilometres from Siem Reap. So it was a pretty scary situation there at that time. There we are. That's how Songkran should be celebrated. See how these kids, bowls, smiles. They said, "Excuse me, can we pour some water over you?" Was that what happened to you last month? Anyway, I apologise for my outfit. I look like some sort of leftover from the San Francisco love power. What do they call it? Flower power.
Flower power.
And that's Peter Finucane with me there. Peter at the back. There he is. Anyway, that was taken up in Tat Phnom, just south of Nakhon Nowhere. Right, I apologise that I haven't got any pictures of pole dancers in my nightlife section, but I have got a picture. I walked into the Superstar one night and ran into Nop, who was our cartoonist for many years at the Post. Some of you in the business will remember Nop. He did some very fine work. And I ran into Nop, and, well, you can see we got on pretty well. That's the other guys worked in different sections of the Post. Some of you old hands might remember Napoleon back in the old days. On a Sunday afternoon, they had a jazz session, and it's a jam session. Wonderful. It was packed out every Sunday afternoon, and there's Laurie Gooding there on the clarinet. Some of you might remember Joe DiRenzio. He's playing the guitar there. He usually played the banjo, but he's playing guitar, and that was used to be a wonderful Sunday afternoon session. That's on Patpong at the Napoleon Lounge. Now if you look on the left, is probably the most famous person in the book. Can anyone tell me who it is?
Bernard Trink. Yes.
Bernard Trink. And there are a few faces there, Julian, that you might recognise. This was Trink was doing his Sunday round on Soy Cowboy in the late 70s, and he came into the bar and found this lot in there. So there we are, Trink. That's Peter and me in the Nakhon. Nothing much to say about that. I think it's the second time I went to Phuket. I went with Norman Batorf, who's sitting there, and we arrived. There was a huge thunderstorm, and for the next 2 days you couldn't do anything. The whole of Phuket town was underwater, heavily underwater. So we did the only thing we could do is just walk around the town and wade around with everybody else. And of course, in Thailand, if you wade around in the water, you always meet somebody. And that's Norman met a few people there. It's a wonderful, typical Thai spirit, I think. They didn't seem bothered at all about the floods. I'll skip that because it takes too long to explain. There we are. Now look at. There's a certain gentleman in this picture looking very dapper. This was on the set of a film that was being made, and we had to go. We were all extras, and we had to go to Don Mueang, and we spent most of the day sitting on this old Dakota. They had to shoot a scene on an old Dakota. It was supposed to be in Cambodia. Phnom Chen Thong Airport. Anyway, there we were. We spent all day there, and the actual screen time we had was about 5 seconds, I think, Tony, in the end.
What was the movie?
Movie was called Angkor.
Angkor.
Which you wouldn't have heard about, partly because I wrote part of the screenplay, and didn't exactly hit the big time. But it was great fun. I think I'll just name a few of the people there. There's Tony there, as I said, looking dapper. There's John Hale, David Pratt, and Steve Van Beek here, who many of you would know Steve. Anyway, there we are, extras And when you're an extra, you really know you're extra. Oh, have I got time to explain?
Yeah, go on. It's okay.
Does anybody else remember the Idam story? You do, John? I'll try and do it as briefly as possible. A Black Panther escaped from a home in Bangkok, a house in Bangkok, where they'd been keeping it as a pet. Now, why anyone in Bangkok would have a panther as a pet, I don't know, but it escaped. And you can imagine people got a bit scared, especially around the Makassar area where it was spotted running around. So for at least a month, they tried to track down this panther, but no one could get it. They got lots of stray dogs, and big black stray dogs were particularly vulnerable. But anyway, then suddenly, out of the blue, they announced that the Black Panther, which they had been named Idam, had been captured. And it's wonderful. These two guys had sneaked up on it and overpowered it, and they were real heroes. And the next day, every paper in Thailand had these pictures of the panther and these two guys, and they were called in one of the papers, I think it's the Post, the heroes of Makassar, because they'd captured this panther. And then the authorities quickly acted very unusually quickly, actually, and they took the panther up to Utai Thani and released him there. And I think that's a lovely picture. There's the panther being released back into the jungle. So, story over, but not quite. About 2 days later, a zookeeper from the northeast came down to Bangkok, and he was furious. He said he wanted to know what happened to the Black Panther that two people borrowed from him a week before. They said they were doing it for a show. And I suppose that was accurate. It was a real show. Anyway, so, well, those two guys, they went from being the heroes of Makassar to having to pay this guy for his Black Panther, which was now running around in the Utai Thani jungle. And so one follow-up from that, sorry, I got that. It was, what was I going to say? I forgot. Sorry, I forgot.
It's not related to the one in Kanchanaburi. Oh, sorry. I'm just trying to think how it all ended up. Oh yes. No. All I want to say is they never actually caught the original panther that escaped. So every time I go past the Makassar rail yards, I find myself looking to see if I can see a black tail or something sneaking around the back of those, or the bushes in Makassar. Anyway, there we are. As Tony mentioned, we went up travelling all over the northeast quite often. Our most regular place was the village in Yasaton, where our maid came from. This is the maid that some of you would know as MS Yasaton, that I used to write about. And the village was called, translated into English as the village in the middle of a field. So you can imagine what sort of village it was. It was a very poor village, but the people there were so nice, absolutely lovely. And there's Tony in a typical northeastern mode. That's all right. Okay, and talking of Miss MS Yasaton, that was her and her husband Noi, when we were living on Soi 49. And she had a cart which did Gai Yang and Somdam and stuff like that, which
they'd prepare it at our house and then take it just down the soy a bit and sell it. And it became a very profitable business. And I took phone calls and people asking me, can I have three chicken and 2 sometimes? Anyway, Noi, that MS Yasaton, her nickname was Tong. Tony and I knew her as Tong. Tony lived at this house too. And Noi is still working for me at my house now, looking after the house and looking after the garden. He's a lovely guy, as Tony knows. He's a real salt of the earth guy. Anyway, that's Tong and Noi. And there she is up in the village in Yasaton with her son Jack. As you see, I said in the 1980s. So Jack is now in his 30s. But she was a lovely lady, Tom. This is also Soy 49. We lived in, the house wasn't that great, but the garden was great, except the one drawback was that we were in the lowest part of Sukhumvit and very vulnerable to floods. So one morning I woke up and that's what our front garden looked like. And it stayed like that for about 3 weeks. Also at the house, John Lester, who I mentioned earlier, arranged a beer tasting session. And he invited a few local authors around. The idea was we tasted some beers and made comments about it, wrote about it.
Roger, can we point out there's someone interesting in that photograph? Constance Beasley. Can anyone spot Constance Beasley in that? This is the writer of some of the funniest letters you'll ever see in the Bangkok newspapers. It's Bill Page, there in the white shirt, second in from the right.
Yes, that's Bill. Thanks, Jim. That's Bill sitting next to Jim Eckhart, who some of you might know. He's written some very funny novels, Jim. And to his left is Colin Pipperell. And yes, you mentioned Bill. I can remember Bill at that session because the maid was serving us, while we were drinking, the maid was serving us all this Isan food, which was all hot, usual. And a lot of it, most of it was somtam. And when Bill, after about the 4th beer, Bill was asked, could you comment on this beer, Bill? And what does it taste like? And he said, it tastes like somtam. And actually, we all agreed, because we couldn't tell the difference between the beers after we've been eating the somtam. Oh, wrong way. We're almost there. For a lot of the time, when I was at the Post, the editor, who was my boss, the editor-in-chief, was Kunte Chokadikij. And Kunte loved, he wrote about politics, but he loved music. And he was very proud of his, rightly very proud of his daughter, Pooh. And she performed, Kunte took me down to see her perform on a couple of occasions. And she was terrific, very wonderful voice and a very strong presence. Anyway, there she is performing with someone I think most of you recognise. Tina
Turner.
That's me and Eckhart at the Plernship Book Fair in the days when it was at the British Embassy. We were selling books. I think I was selling, that was my first book I was trying to sell. Unfortunately, as always, Jim Eckhart, he sold a lot more than I did. I have one chapter. Most of the book is about the old days. I have one chapter that's suggested by Kumpichai from the Post that I spent my last 15 years at the Post as a sports editor, so I ought to put in something about that. So this is my name-dropping moment. There's me with Jeff Hurst, who scored the hat-trick in the 1966 World Cup final, as any German people here will remember. And we were at the Sunderland Stadium of Light. I used to play, when I was first here, I used to play for a team called the Cosmopolitans. And it was a wonderful experience because we had different players from every possible country you can imagine. And at times we had 10 different nationalities playing. And Colin played for them too. This is just sort of one of the teams we had. And at one stage we had an Israeli tank commander, a Soviet spy, and an Italian pop singer. That was our sort of midfield. So you can imagine how we were really good. And there's that's Eugene on far left. That's the gentleman from the Soviet embassy who played for us. Yeah, lovely chap. So as you can see, it's a real. And the person on the right in the ordinary shirt was Günter Glom, who organised the league, and he was a German international in his days. He played for Nuremberg back in the old days. Well, more football. I'm sorry. The Post had its own team, and we played in a regional tournament several times. And this one was held at Klong Toi, at the Port Authority in Klong Toi. And if you see just behind me, you can see that John Lester. Actually, we did quite well in that tournament, I think. We're almost at the end. Oh, no, too quick. Elephant polo. People will have different opinions on elephant polo. That's me on the left there. All I know, the organisers wanted some sort of joke game before they started the serious stuff. So they got a team from the Post and the Nation to play one another before the real stuff started. And so we got dragged into it. And I spent the whole time just hanging on for dear life. I couldn't care less who won.
Is that true, Roger, that someone ended up with a rather smelly shoe?
I think quite likely.
An elephant backed onto someone's foot.
Amongst our opponents was, I think still is Alan Parkhouse still here? Oh, he's in the... talk about bad timing.
He's cleaning his shoe.
This is his big moment. I think Alan Parkhouse is at the Nation.
Here he is. Alan, you've got to verify the story about the smelly shoe.
Well, Alan was in the opposing team.
I was there that day as well.
And I think he even had the nerve to score a goal, or whatever you call it, in elephant polo.
I don't know, is the microphone open? Yes.
Anyway,
it was a very close contest. And let's say there was a scrum, and one of the elephants backed onto Roger, and he had to leave his shoe outside the hotel room afterwards. I think that's the best way to put it. I think I better leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Those were great contests. I think Alan was just as relieved as me to get off the elephant at the end of it. And the last one, I have to show this. That's my wife. Unfortunately, she's not here tonight. With her usual great sense of timing, she went off to Japan for a temple tour. When I told her about tonight, she said, yeah, that's good, sorry she couldn't come. And her final words were, don't get drunk. So, cheers.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, any of you got a question, now's your chance just to where Alan was standing. There's a microphone there. Julian's first up.
Yeah, you've all been here a long time. At what stage in the last 50 years or nearly 50 years did each of you decide that you were going to spend the rest of your life here? Or did you never decide?
Tony or Colin?
Well, in the mid-70s, I was, there was the Vietnam War going on, and my thoughts were, well, when I cannot travel by road down to Phuket, that's the time to move on. And that never happened, because after the fall of Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos, somehow the spirit of the insurgency disappeared. I mean, in Thailand, there was no, in other words, it was a, a failure in a way for those countries, and they couldn't drum up any enthusiasm. So that was my first thought, and after that, no, I mean, this is my home and has been now for 48 years. So, but that was my initial thought, and it never happened. So I was spared, and glad to still be here.
Colin? Well,
right, as we said, I did the overland trip and became increasingly unhappy with what I saw. And I just look at my diary of that trip today, and I was writing about Calcutta, how incredibly, indescribably poor and unhappy a place, and I was unhappy. And then we flew from, because as Roger was saying earlier, you couldn't go through Burma at that time, so we also caught a flight from Burma to Bangkok. And I was not as homesick and unhappy, but arriving in Bangkok, within 2 or 3 days, something magical happened. I can't explain it, but I just thought, this is just a wonderful place, and I'd like to be here for a long time. 44 years later, still here.
Roger?
I think it took me about 24 hours before I decided that this could possibly be a great place to stay.
Very good. We got another question there.
Yeah, sure. Ian Hollingworth, I'm a retired member, and there is a question at the end of this to Roger, mainly. And I want to thank him a great deal for opening up a lot of memories for me, because I think I'm of a similar age, and the overland trip was something we were able to do when we were young. I remember, for instance, in Turkey, the cold, for Christ's sake, that was so cold in Erzurum, where you, in those days, of course, you had facial hair, and the breathing ended up with icicles on your moustache. And it was the first time I actually saw camels in snow. I had no idea that they could be both in the same image, camels and snow. Afghanistan, I fell asleep on the side. I wasn't in a bus, I was doing public transport. I fell asleep on the side of the road. I woke up and there was 2 Afghan tribesmen standing over me with rifles slung over their shoulder. How times have changed. I walked up and walked away. I was not in any trouble there. And Kabul was my first experience of actually being in an earthquake. That was quite unforgettable. So my question really is this, Roger. Those days have gone. We had so many opportunities that maybe don't exist now. What would you say to young people from the UK specifically who maybe are thinking about exploring and exploring this part of the world? What advice would you give them?
Well, yeah, as you say, you can't make the trips like we did in those days, because it's just physically impossible to come through Iran, Afghanistan and those places. So unfortunately, a lot of the people, they have to fly here. And I'm glad I didn't fly here and suddenly face Thai culture, because I wouldn't have had a clue what was going on. So I think the only advice I would give is, if people are planning to come out here, learn a lot about the country and the culture before they come, and get to know that not everything will be the same as it is back home, and there will be some things that happen that you can't understand and you can't explain, but you're in this country and you go along with it, and maybe after a while you find how the country works. I think that's about all I can say.
Okay. If there are no other questions, I'll just throw one or two, if I may. Tony, you shared a house with him for so long. Was there a moment when you didn't want to, or what kept you together for so long?
Don't answer that.
No, I was very happy to share the 4 houses we were living in with Roger, and he was always a good companion. We made many up-country trips, so and in fact we're neighbours now in the same muban or housing estate, and we're very happy to have each other sort of nearby and everything. So again, no issues, no problems. Thank you.
Okay. So, Colin, good. I'm sorry. Okay, we've got the shrimp here. Colin's going to have to run some of his photos one day, I've been told.
I have to lower the microphone here because my name is Shrimp. And I have one question for all, especially for Roger, of course, for all 3 of you, who all came to Thailand more or less about the same time as I came. Actually, you all came after me. I was a bit earlier. But my question is, after coming to Thailand and understanding what an amazingly interesting, different, erudite, unusual country this is, especially at that time in the late 60s, early 70s. What was your personal, individual feelings about being away from where you were and being in a new country and meeting new, different, and very interesting and very beautiful young women?
Funny you should ask that.
That's my question.
I'm supposed to answer.
Well, we all answer.
Well, I have to admit that one of the first things I noticed in Thailand was that the women were extremely beautiful. You can't dispute that. I mean, that's just a sort of natural observation. And and I still find all Thai women beautiful. And I always have found Thai women beautiful. And I'm not sure how I'm going to answer the rest of this question. But interestingly, though, all Thai men, when I was first here, nearly every Thai man I met, and the first thing they'd say to me was, "Aren't the Thai girls beautiful?" And I said, "Yeah." They were very pleased about it. So everyone was happy about it. The Thai men were happy about it. And the Thai women were happy because everybody called them beautiful. So I don't think we've got anything to complain about.
Yes, well, I absolutely agree. And the Thai culture is such that the people are so friendly and welcoming. This was, I think, the biggest contrast coming through Pakistan, India, and you come to Thailand and suddenly people are not staring at you, they're just smiling at you. And I think also for young bachelors arriving in Thailand, the young ladies are very very friendly, and there is, of course, I think we shouldn't overlook the bar scene as being, you know, a place to go and have a few beers, and the smiles get wider and broader as you drink a few more, and so on. But I think really it's a cultural thing that the Thai culture is very, very welcoming, and it is enhanced by the young ladies, for the young men anyway.
Patrick, I'm still learning about Thai women.
Good answer.
How long did it take to learn the language back then?
After all this time you've been living in this country.
You're always learning it as you go along.
Don't you think, after all this time you've been living in this country, don't you think your sexual preferences have gone in a very specific direction?
This is an optional question.
My sexual preferences have always remained the same and will never change.
Tony's a late addition to this panel. You can get a pass on that one if you want.
No, the direction hasn't changed for me.
Colin?
I refuse to answer that question on the grounds it may well incriminate me.
Okay, on that note, has anyone got any further final questions?
Yeah, one serious question. This is a bit of a minge, actually. Roger, I don't understand the subtitle. When Thailand truly was the land of smiles, what has caused you to change your opinion of the country? I mean, to me, the country is still as welcoming as it was in 1969.
Yes, Julian, I think that's a very fair point you raised there. I think at the time when I was thinking about the title of the book, it came at a time when there was a lot of people complaining about how the Thais were not as friendly as they used to be, and how things had changed a lot. And I was probably semi-influenced by that. So maybe if we have a second print, a second edition, I say why Thailand is still the land of smiles. Yeah, yeah, a good point.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it looks like we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you very, very much. If you could put your hands together for our panellists. I think there are still maybe a couple of copies up there of Roger's book. He'd be happy to autograph it. Please hang around and have a drink. We're not going anywhere. And if you're near the bar, it's my birthday and I'll have one with you. All the best. Thank you for coming and see you again.
Cheers.